Your word only spoken, Lord, your word only heard. What an honor it is to be asked back to preach here at St. John's. For about 2.5 years, I was the rector at Emmanuel Church in Weston, most recently. I was overjoyed when Elaine gave me the lessons for this week, because I love this gospel from the Gospel of John. But early in my career, I heard a story that helped me to have a broader understanding of the true purpose of preaching, what I'm doing right now. It all goes back to a story I once heard about a priest who, while driving home late one night, the car careened off the road and he was on his way to the pearly gates. And when he got there, St. Peter greeted him and said, "Welcome, Reverend. Let me take you to your church." Well, the priest was surprised, and St. Peter said, "Didn't you know that clergy got their own churches in heaven?" And he said, "No, they didn't tell me that at seminary." So as St. Peter was walking the man to his church, he said, "Oh, let me just check the records. In fact, you've been given a cathedral. Congratulations, a cathedral in heaven." Well, you can imagine the minister, he was overjoyed. Cathedral in heaven. So as he got there, he saw this huge set of banners. "Welcome, new dean of cathedral." He was thrilled about that. The choir was rehearsing. So St. Peter said, "Look, I'm going to take you back to your house so you get ready for this big event, the installation of the new dean in heaven." So he goes back and he puts on his robes and he heads back, and he can't believe the clamor. There's people all over the place. And finally, the service starts, and he notices that everybody is so attentive. And it's just breathtaking to see how, when he begins his sermon, everybody kind of leans forward in their chair just to get a better earful of the sermon. And so he goes on and on with the sermon, and then suddenly, up in the pulpit, a trap door opens, and down he goes, just tumbling through this long aluminum chute. And when he finally gets back, the chute opens right in front of the pearly gates. And he says to St. Peter, "I don't get it. The banners, the choir, everything, it was just so beautiful." And St. Peter said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, this is also heaven for the parishioners." So that gave me a new perspective on preaching. And so I take that perspective with me when I come here to St. John's once again to preach. One of Jesus' greatest gifts, I believe, is his preaching. This is especially evident in this gospel for this morning. Jesus said to his disciples, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower." Jesus loved to preach using agrarian metaphors. I'm sure you can think of many other examples besides this one, the planting of the mustard seed, or the references to the threshing floor where they will be processed like wheat. This worked well, since many of his followers served by planting vegetables and by tilling the soil. They were an agrarian culture, so obviously they would better understand Jesus' preaching. But seeing through these metaphors, Jesus shows us that he is the God who acts. He acts in our everyday lives. He acts in our world. John goes on to quote him by saying, "He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit." Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word. I was intrigued when I read that part of the gospel. You've already been cleansed by the word. Whenever you see the word, you have to understand that it's Jesus referring to God. God removes every branch that bears no fruit. And then you've already been cleansed by the word that I've spoken to you. But then Jesus, after all the references to pruning, becomes the great soother. He goes on to say, "Abide in me as I abide in you. Those who abide in me bear much fruit." How wonderful is that? What a wonderful and reassuring way that Jesus turns to his followers and says, "You know what? If you abide in me, you abide in God." But this soothing that Jesus does rapidly turns in the other direction when Jesus says, "Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. such branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. This must be some kind of mistake. Someone must have written this gospel in this feel-good world. We don't talk about that, do we? About hell and about judgment? Jesus must have been kidding. You know, when I was at seminary, we were all excited because the newly ordained and consecrated Bishop Harris, was coming to the Washington National Cathedral to preach. And I was at a seminary just about 5 miles away, so it was natural that the dean would get a bus together to take us all into the cathedral. So this friend of mine from Texas came up to me and said, "You know, Rob, the gospel for today is a tough one. The gospel that Bishop Harris is going to preach on is a tough one because it says, Jesus says, did I come to bring peace? No, I came to bring war, and I have a sword, and I'm going to separate mother from daughter and father from brother." And she's not going to preach on that. She's part of that left-wing, New England, Connecticut, liberal faction. She's going to just ignore it and preach about the environment all day. Well, you know how we liberals are, just preaching about the environment and not confronting these very tough gospels, these very demanding gospels. So Bishop Harris gets up into the pulpit at the cathedral and begins by saying, this is an awfully tough gospel, but you know what? We can't run away from toughness if we're really going to abide in God's love. And suddenly she just preached on the gospel. She preached on how difficult it was to be a Christian. Not how easy it was, how really difficult it was to be a Christian. Because there would be demands that would be asked of you. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. Here we are once again with beautiful agrarian metaphors that Jesus is using. And he talks about abiding in God's love. I'd just like to pose a question that you might take back with you as you leave this church today. How do we abide in God's love? What does abide mean anyway? It's kind of an old-fashioned word. There was that great old-time Baptist hymn, Abide in Me. But what does it mean to us to abide in God's love? What does it mean to us in these agrarian metaphors? We're not agrarians. Well, maybe some of you are, but I'm not. I did buy some turf builder at Taylor yesterday. I'm not sure that qualifies me as agrarian. But it reminded me very much of the story of the guy who dies and he goes to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, he sees this long line. And there's a sign above the pearly gates where it says 100 points to enter into heaven. So I hear all these people, he hears all these people in front of him trying to justify their existence on earth by claiming all sorts of accomplishments and all sorts of associations and things of that sort. So finally the man gets up and St. Peter says, all right, 100 points to get into heaven. Speak your piece. And so the man said, well, I was head usher at my church for 54 years. St. Peter said, good, 2 points. 2 points, the guy thought. He thought he would get in just on that. So then he started to think, well, let's see, I coached Little League Baseball for 2 years. All right, half a point. And so this went on for another 10 minutes. Every time he would say something, St. Peter would say, well, that's good, but you're only going to get half a point for it. Finally, the man says, in great exasperation, how, for the grace of God, am I going to get into heaven? And St. Peter says, oh yeah, that's right, grace of God, 95 points. Come on in. We find ourselves in the middle of a world that tries to keep us from abiding in God's love. But as Jesus says, it's really the cornerstone of our faith. By abiding in God's love, we are one with God, just like we are one with God when we come up to the communion rail. The good news for this morning's gospel is that yes, there will be judgment on the last day. But as long as we abide in God's love, as long as we bear much fruit and become a disciple of Christ, we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.